Mark Armour, welcome to the Baseball Bookshelf Conversations.
Great to be here, Ron.
Actually, it's welcome back because it was about 5 years ago that you were on discussing another one of your books, but this one is, I think, particularly relevant considering who's playing in the World Series this year. The book is Intentional Balk: Baseball's Thin Line Between Innovation and Cheating. And of course, the Houston Astros are now the poster team for cheating in baseball. I'm wondering what your thoughts are uh, on their success now. I mean, a few years ago, people would have pointed to what they did at the time and complained about it. But now they seem to have, at least on the field, shall we say, overcome that, or is it still hanging in the background?
Well, I think the Astros have a great organization. I think that they have figured it out. I think that they have great development in the organization. They seem to have great coaching. In the last few years, they've lost Garrett Cole, they've lost Carlos Correa, they've lost um, George Springer, and it hasn't seemed to really affected them at all. I mean, they haven't really made a huge effort to keep those players. I think that they just seem to be confident in their development machine to replace them. I believe that they are. One of the themes of our book essentially is that they're about the thin line between innovation and cheating. Is that throughout the history of baseball there have been obviously a lot of cheating, scandals or what have you, stories. And oftentimes it is the most innovative, smartest teams that are the ones that are getting up to that line and crossing the line. And I think there's a that this is absolutely true for the Astros, that they, I think, are a very bright organization filled with people that wake up every day trying to figure out a way to get an edge. And those are the teams that are most likely to figure out a way to do it better than other people. I mean, cheating is cheating has been going on in baseball since somebody first picked up a ball, I suspect, and sign stealing of using off field mechanical means has been going on at least since the 1890s. And I think the Astros are or were better at it than anybody else. They said, well, if we're going to do this, we're just going to do it. We're going to come up with the best possible way ever to do this, and that's kind of what they did. So I guess I don't know if they're doing anything now that would be considered illegal. I mean, it's certainly possible. Um, but I don't think they're sign stealing in this way. I mean that I think that ship has sailed. The uh, the monitors aren't next to the dugout anymore. They can't be. So I think that their means of doing what it is that they did, that type of malfeasance, I think that has been blocked.
Now, I think people pretty much have a good idea of what cheating is. Cheating is, scuffing the ball, uh, putting something in the bat to make it lighter and swing more easily. Sign stealing, as you have mentioned. How would you describe or define innovation?
So innovation is really can be anything. This is something that is true in society in general, is just new ways to solve problems. So innovation in, for example, pitching is just as simple as figuring out a new pitch. And I think that it is generally the smart pitchers that are trying to figure out a new pitch or figure out a way to get the ball to do something that it didn't used to do for them. And that could be a new grip, or that could be, holding their, or, moving their wrist in a way that they haven't moved it before. And I think that throughout history, the smartest, hardworkingest, not a word, pitchers have been have been trying to do this, forever. I think that that almost every way that you can think of to get a ball to move has been tried back to the 19th century. And one of the things that people have learned over the years is that if you put a substance on the ball, you can get it to do things. So I think most kids who play baseball like in their backyard and are throwing pitches, they try to figure out, can I throw a knuckleball? Can can I get this ball to curve? Can I? And I think that major league pitchers do that. And I think many of the smartest ones say, like, what if I put a little bit of saliva on my thumb? What will happen then? Can I get the ball to behave in a different way? And I expect that the majority of major league pitchers have done something like this, either fooling around um, or in some cases in a game. That is innovation, and the rules of baseball essentially put barriers on this innovation by saying, okay, innovate to your heart's content, but these are the things you're not allowed to do, which is to put any kind of foreign substance on the ball, with the exception of the pine tar rag, which is hanging out behind the mound. You can use that on your fingers, but otherwise you can't. And I think that our expectation, probably somewhat naive, is that pitchers will learn how to do all of these things and yet not ever do them in a game. And that's sort of what we're counting on. And I think that I think generally we're wrong. That doesn't happen.
When you talk about putting foreign substance on the ball, the pitcher that comes to mind, at least for people in our generation, would be Gaylord Perry.
Right.
And there seems to be almost there's a division between what some, for lack of a better word, would consider a folk hero for fooling around with this stuff. Like Perry seemed to be like a folk hero almost when he was playing, and then you have people who obviously. Like I'm thinking people who gambled, who cheated to gamble for their teams to lose. The Black Sox scandal, Hal Chase, a couple other people come to mind. But there's always been like a Robin Hoodish quality, I think, to some of these players who push the line and seem to get away with it, like Perry. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I think without question. I think certainly without question. I think that um, yes. So I grew up with Perry. I loved Perry. Perry was one of my favorite. I mean, I didn't see him as much because he was, we grew up in a time when you really only got to see your local team, and then whoever was good in the World Series, which was never Perry. But um, I I loved his story. I loved the fact that when Gaylord Perry was pitching, he was the whole story, right? He was the story before the game. He was the story. The umpires were concerned about him. The other manager was concerned about him. And then he had a sense of humor about it, right? He wrote a book, and he kind of admitted it all, and then later said, "Well, maybe I was kidding about that too." So he just he was like a con man, in a way that not didn't harm anyone. It didn't harm me anyway. Um, and I think we've become a little more critical of this kind of behavior in general as a society. I think that there is a more of a holier than thou view, and I'm not even suggesting that it's all bad. That's kind of up to you, but I don't know that Perry would be treated the same way today. Um, when we grew up, if you read old baseball histories, like say in the 70s, if you read about olden times, you might have read about interviews with John McGraw or somebody, and he's talking about the stuff that his teams used to do. And I remember reading all this stuff as a kid and thinking, like, God, I can't believe that this actually happened. And he would talk about his team sort of holding on to the belt loops of players and they ran past, or hiding extra balls in the outfield, kicking players, tripping them, throwing tobacco juice on the shoes of hitters just when the pitch is coming. I mean, all this stuff. And it was talked about by the writers or the players who were recounting the time. I think some of this stuff might have been in Glory Other Times, and it was talked about, like you said, in a very romantic kind of way, like we were outlaws, we were players trying to make money for our families, and we just did all these rascal things. And I think now there's sort of this sense of sort of decorum, and there's more of an honor code, and not with everyone, but I think those people would be pilloried today if some of that stuff actually happened. I could be wrong. I mean, you need a time machine to figure that out, but McGraw was. John McGraw is somebody that I figure would do just about anything, right? If he was playing, he would certainly steal signs. He would certainly do steroids. I mean, he would do whatever, because he was that competitor that no one would have wanted around, I think, unless he was on your team.
And back in the day, in those days, they only had two umpires on the field. Now they have four during regular games. And I'm still wondering why they feel they have a need for six umpires in the postseason, because when you look, the line outfielders seem to be like 20 yards away from the infield umpires, and I mean, that's just me. Looking at looking at your table of contents, there are a bunch of different things in here. One of the things that stuck out to me is there's a difference between what the players do on the field, what the managers do on the field, and what the front office does. Talk a little about how the front office cheats.
Yeah. So, there we talk about, we define cheating as, people that, behave in ways that are a violation of some baseball rule, and they do so in order to help their team win. And we deliberately tried to define it specifically and narrowly, not because we were trying to say that things like throwing the World Series, that is somehow okay. It obviously absolutely is not. We just didn't want the book to get too big, so we just said, okay, we're going to focus only on people trying to win, not people trying to lose. And we also did include stuff that was off the field. So there is a rule book, which is not posted anywhere, but there is a rule book that defines how it is that teams have to behave, which is nothing to do with the umpire, which is things like what the rules are for extending contracts to players, and how many players you're allowed to have on your roster, and what the relationship is between you and the minor league organizations you're in, et cetera. And this has always been the case. And the ways you can cheat have varied over time because the rules of operation have changed. For example, there used to be a way you could cheat back in the 1930s, this is what Branch Rickey did, is that there were very strict rules about how many players you're allowed to have under your control as a major league team in the minor leagues. So you could have a certain number of players that you were allowed to have options on with the minor league owner. That was essentially the beginnings of the farm system. And Rickey violated that. Rickey had more than he was allowed to have. He had under the table agreements with more minor league affiliates than he was allowed to, including affiliates in the same league. So there were Cardinal farmhands that were competing with Cardinal farmhands. And this was all discovered, and Judge Landis, who was the commissioner at the time, basically went in, and he didn't really punish Ricky personally, but what he did is he punished the Cardinals essentially by freeing, I think it was like 80 people, 80 players, one of whom was Pete Reiser, who ended up being a star in the Dodgers. So that's one way you can cheat. But if you go to the more modern game, there are rules about bonuses that you can give to players that you draft. If you draft somebody in the first round, there's a slot and you have to stay within that slot. You have a salary cap of bonuses that you're allowed to give for your entire draft. There are international bonus rules. And all of these things, I mentioned all of them because all of them have been broken by people. John Capabella, who was the general manager of the Atlanta Braves, just about 5 years ago, the Braves were caught making lots of illegal agreements with players in the Dominican Republic. So in order to get around bonus rules, for example, they would, if they're only allowed to give $3 million to a player, they would say, okay, we're going to give $6 million to you and your brother, $3 million each. However, wink, wink, actually $5.8 million of that is for you, but you need to work that out with your brother. They would do that kind of thing. And Capabella was kicked out of baseball for life for this. And the Braves, a lot of these people on the Braves were freed. So there have always been, and then during the 50s, there were bonus rules about how much money you're allowed to give to a certain player. I think it was, for a while, it was $400,000, or you had to be on. They had to put you on the major league roster, and there were all kinds of stories that these rules were violated, and some of the players have come out, years later and said, "Oh yeah, the Dodgers gave me more than they were allowed to give me." So there's always been that kind of cheating, really, and our view on this is that we neither forgive nor forget. But on the other hand, we also believe that this is how competitive people are. Ultimately, I mean, if you have a bunch of competitive players and managers and general managers and owners, and you give them a set of rules and you give them fairly high stakes for them in terms of what they can get out of winning, and the consequences are not too onerous, then I think that it's inevitable that somebody's going to cross that line.
You write about the difference between cheating and gamesmanship. So how do you define gamesmanship?
Well, we use the word cheating, as I said, we define what cheating is, and we use the word cheating throughout the book in that way. However, we also acknowledge that there is some cheating that the players think is okay. So even though we use the word cheating, we also say cheating is not always bad, or at least it's not considered to be bad by the people who are ultimately in charge of the game, which is the players and the umpires and whatnot. So the analog that we use is like speed limits on the highway. I think we know what the speed limit is. We violate the speed limit. We don't really want to be pulled over for going 3 miles per hour over the speed limit. The cops don't want to pull us over. Our fellow drivers don't want us pulled over. However, we also know that there's a limit. There's an actual limit that is kind of fuzzy at which point you would expect to be pulled over by the cops. Within the game, there are lots of rules like that. So when we talk about gamesmanship, we are talking generically, we are talking about attempting to fool the umpire. So it is our belief that if you play sports without an umpire, you're playing golf, or you're playing pickup basketball, or you're playing baseball as a kid, um, you have to sort of call your own rules, right? You have to say like, were you out or safe? And if you basically fight over it, the game can't continue, right? If you say I was safe and the other team says you were out and you guys can't come to agreement, then you pretty much can never play again and people won't invite you to play. But once there's an umpire, that's kind of out of your hands. You no longer have to be honest about anything. I mean, if you are playing sandlot baseball and you miss a base on the way to if you miss first base in order to get to second base, you don't admit that you missed first base, right? You just keep playing, and if the umpire didn't see it, well, then that's good for you. And I think that's the way we expect to play, and that's the way we expect our kids to play. Even though these are kids who we want to be honest people, if your kid is playing in little league and he traps a ball in the outfield and he holds the ball up to the umpire and says, haha, I caught it, that's kind of what you want him to do mostly. I mean, I'm not going to say that that's what you want. Maybe that's not what you want him to do. That's what most people want their kid to do. And I think that's what we want, and that's gamesmanship. And we quote we at the beginning of the book we quote Rogers Hornsby, who actually wrote a book near the end of his life. And in one of the chapters of his book, which is all about cheating, he says that when he played Major League Baseball and minor leagues and coached and managed, he said he was in organized baseball for 50 years, and there was cheating in every single game he ever played in. And that's like a shocking way to start your story. And of course, when you read into it, you realize that a lot of the cheating that he was talking about is stuff that we came to believe is part of the game. Not all of it. Some of it, he talked about sign stealing. He talked about, doing things like doctoring the pitcher's mound for your pitcher. I think a lot of that stuff we do think of as cheating, but he would also talk about something like the neighborhood play in baseball, which most of your listeners probably know. It's basically gone now. This doesn't happen anymore. But for many years, the middle infielder would not touch the base when he was turning a double play. He just wouldn't. He would get close to it, and you might not even notice it if you were watching with the naked eye. But if you saw it in replay, you'd realize, wow, he sort of dragged his foot near the base. And, we always kind of figured that, well, I think maybe we've been told that, well, a lot of this has to do with the fact that he doesn't want to get hurt, right? He doesn't want to, you could get hurt if you stumble over the base and there's a base runner barreling in. But it's also a lot easier to turn the double play if you don't have to touch the base, because the base is a pain in the neck or a pain in the ankles. And today, you can't do that because they would replay it and they would show that you didn't touch the base, and the guy would be called safe. Hornsby talked about this, and he talked about the people who were, it seemed to be fairly new at the time, like only in the previous decade or so, and this was in the early 60s. So this would be, sometime in the 50s. And he credited Nellie Fox and Bobby Richardson as being sort of the best at this, the neighborhood play. Today, we would probably consider pitch framing by the catcher to be in this area, right? Where you are deliberately trying to get the umpire to make a call that is not the right call. That's what you're trying to do. I mean, sometimes you're trying to get him to make the call that is the right call, but for the most part, the ones that we watch happen on TV, sometimes it's pretty egregious, right? The pitch is 8 inches outside or something, and the catcher either smoothly, if it's a good catcher, or somewhat clunkily, if it's a mediocre catcher, drags the ball into the strike zone. And I think that there probably are purists out there that think of this as cheating, right? You are attempting to fool the umpire. And we do quote some umpires that talk about this as being somewhat embarrassing to them. They don't like the catchers doing this because it makes them look bad. Everyone's booing them because of this. I think that happens less now because we have so many smart ways to watch. And even though I don't believe the box on the screen is 100% accurate, my view is that the umpires are a lot better than the catchers. They don't seem to get fooled that much these days, but anyway. So gamesmanship just generically is kind of trying to game the umpire, I would say.
In the few minutes we have left, I want to switch gears a little bit. You wrote this book with Daniel Levitt. Uh, what was the division of labor in a book like this?
Well, we have partnered up before, and I think we have a pretty good rapport at this point. But it helps if you have a book where you can tackle pieces of it separately. So, for example, he would go off and say, "I'm gonna explore sign stealing," and he would spend 2 or 3 months on this, while I'd be looking at the picture and finding out all the stories I could and talking to people and whatnot. And then at some point, I would write this chapter about the pitcher, and then I would send it off to him and as a draft, and he would, edit it. Basically, he would go through it and say, "This story doesn't make sense," or he would add some new story, or he would help with the wording. And I would do the same thing to him with his sign stealing chapter. And then as we moved along, we would look for ways to sort of tie it together. We would say, okay, we need to have a thread here so we can talk about when we write chapter 4, we can refer back to chapter 2 and whatnot. And we would add those things as we went along. But for the most part, every one of these chapters had a primary author that wrote the first draft. And then we batted around after that.
Well, it's obviously a good collaboration because it's a fascinating and very thought-provoking book. We've been talking with Mark Armour, co-author with Daniel Levitt of Intentional Balk, Baseball's Thin Line Between Innovation and Cheating. Mark, thanks so much for talking with us today.
I appreciate you having me on, Ron. I hope you're enjoying the World Series.